We left off when I was talking about how I had made my first venture into joining with the Fidelistas as they were fighting this last-ditch battle in 1958. And I had mentioned that I had spent the night in an old truck, sleeping as best I could in Grand Junction, and then had gotten back on the road and been picked up by some fishermen who were heading for Wichita, and I was going to get a ride with them that far before continuing, when the monitor broadcast had described my route and my objective and my father's position as Attorney General and everything else, I guess, that they could think of. I don't remember what was in the radio broadcast, except I knew I was blown. And but they had said, you know, we will not interfere with you, even though you probably should go home. It's really none of our business. We'll drop you outside of Wichita, and you can make your way there, and we'll forget we ever saw you. What happened was, in the FBI roadblock stop, one agent grabbed me out of the back of that car as soon as he saw me, and this is probably the friendliest arrest I would ever have. I can't complain about it. He acted as if he was angry, but he said, "The FBI director says you're not to be allowed to talk to the press no matter what, so I can't take you to jail, which is where you belong. So I'm going to take you to my house and you can spend the night there, and then I'm going to take you to the airport in the morning and put you on a plane back to Boise," which is what happened. His wife made me some sandwiches. I slept on the couch, and in the morning I got dressed, and I realized then that the FBI had sealed off that entire block. There was no way anybody from the press was getting anywhere near that house of his, or which was another way of saying getting anywhere near me, and they never did. The press didn't get to me until I got back to Boise. So I flew on back to Boise on a United flight, and that was the end of my adventure there. But because of all of these circumstances, this trip got a lot of attention in the national press. It even came to the attention of Fidel Castro and the revolutionaries in the mountains down there, because they started broadcasting on Radio Rebelde a message which they would continue to report, and that was that unless a person was old enough, which was a pointed reference to me, they shouldn't be involved at all, and 16 wasn't old enough. So then they would say, furthermore, you North Americans need to realize that if you come here and you're armed, and we don't want you if you're not armed, then you have a real good chance of being picked up, tortured, and killed by Batistas secret police. So it's not a wise thing to do. But still, this flood of North Americans was coming. But it was also coming largely from sailors and Marines in Guantanamo Bay who were jumping ship in order to go and help the rebels fight. Kind of like you've got Russian army volunteers jumping ship, so to speak, to go and help the Ukrainians fight against that fascist dictatorship in Kiev. So at any rate, all of this was going on, and the Fidelistas had mixed feelings about it, because they don't really need volunteers unless those volunteers can come with guns. It would be nice if they could speak Spanish, and most of these gringos can't. So, you know, it's a mixed bag. At any rate, that's how my first venture, my first contact with these guys occurred. Now, back in the Sierra, Fidel's forces on one side of rebel territory were confronting 12,000 Batista Army troops. This is a place where the Batista Army moved into a place called Estrada Palma, because they had a sugar mill there that they were supposed to protect, and at the same time they thought that it was not well defended. They confronted there about 300 Fidelista soldiers. Well, 12,000 men ought to be able to handle 300 soldiers, right? But again, it was the same story as it had been earlier. That is, the rebels would fight a stall and retreat action, and the soldiers who joined the army originally because they were unemployed and they could at least have a place to sleep and have 3 meals a day, a 3 hots and a cot recruiting strategy, getting paid $25 a month. There's a limit to how much danger you're going to put yourself into for $25 a month and 3 hots and a cot. So the Batista Army, as large as it wasn't very aggressive. It wasn't anxious to fight. And the Fidelistas, on the other hand, had spent money to get here. and they were very anxious to fight, and so they set up ambush after ambush. It was a classical stall and retreat action that Americans had gotten used to fighting in Latin American countries now for many years. Well, the Army forces moved against this Estrada Palma region in 4 columns. Che let the 1st Battalion get some 4 miles along its way before his main force ambushed that column. The Army vanguard took rifle fire and started running for cover. Next, the Army brought up its tanks, which of course they got from the U.S., to clear their flanks, but they ran into minefields the rebels had laid for them, and they lost all their tanks. At this point, the other Army soldiers began to run away, and the rebel army, of course, went over to chasing them as they ran. Confusion and panic dominated that entire offensive, and the Batista Army of 12,000 men dissolved in a 300-man counterattack. That was the closest that the Batista forces ever got to Mount Turquino. Now, on that same day, there was a battle on the 28th of June where the Army was marched also out of a town called Santo Domingo, which was nearby. Now, it was under the command of a colonel named Angel Sanchez Mosquera, and Mosquera had a bad reputation for capturing, torturing, and killing peasants for no particular reason other than his suspicion that they were probably supporting the rebels. So he had a reputation of being tough. But it's one thing to be tough on a bunch of unarmed peasants, another thing to be tough on a bunch of men that came here to kill you. So this battle at Santo Domingo did not go very well for them either. And he got ambushed at Villa Vicencio, which is close to Pueblo Nuevo, and he got wiped out. Mosquero's men tried moving forward against the Villa Vicencio operation, and then one of its companies, Company N, found itself surrounded and isolated from their compadre company, and the rebels took it under fire of 50 caliber machine guns and 60 caliber mortars, and it was annihilated, and the surviving soldiers surrendered at 8 a.m. the following morning on June 29, 58. Company N had lost 26 dead, 27 wounded, and the rest of the survivors taken POW. Fidel was real clever with these POWs. He never mistreated them, turned them over as quickly as he could to the Red Cross, and so they came back with fairly good, well, they didn't kill me. That was one good thing. They could tell people. They did take my shoes and my guns, but compared to my life, that's a minor loss. So the rebels were now 3 and Batista 0. This failed Batista offensive was turning into a weapons bonanza for the rebels, because Che's forces took from Company N alone 38 M1 rifles, 5 M1 carbines, a 30 caliber machine gun with 10 boxes of ammo, a San Cristobal machine gun that was a Dominican manufacture, 15,000 rounds of ammo, 3,000 303 caliber Springfield rifles, 2 Thompson submachine guns, and 15,000 rounds of ammunition for it. And they seized 60 full field packs complete with everything from leather, uniforms, blankets, and tents, and new microwave communication equipment, which were an entirely new addition to rebel communications, and new to combat worldwide in general anyway, not to mention boxes and boxes of canned food. So they were turning this offensive and their defense against Batista into a real weapons and supplies bonanza. Raul Castro and the 2nd Frank País Front, which as they were calling it, now began to counterattack in June of 58. The idea was for Raul to take some of the heat off of Fidel by opening up a new front on the other side of Oriente province on its north coast from the San Cristobal Mountains in March of 58. In late June of 58, while Che's forces were annihilating Cantillo, Mosquera, and Villa Vicencio, Raul took 50 U.S. citizens, mostly civilians, hostage until the U.S. stopped its shipment of warplanes and air-to-ground rocket weapons to Batista. Now, years later, I learned that Raul Castro and the girl that he was going to marry had decided they had to do something radical because Batista had gotten a lot of bombers from the States, and they were doing a lot of damage to Raul's column. And the only way they could stop that was to tell the Americans that until they stopped supplying Batista with weapons, that they were going to hold on to these hostages. So this girl that he was dating and became his wife, named Vilma Espin in this area, says that it was absolutely essential that they stop these air attacks. Well, they did. By seizing these U.S.-owned properties and these U.S. citizens working there, Fidel was playing his last card of popularity in the U.S. American population, North American population in general, had been supporting Fidel, and they also thought that Washington should stop arming Fidel's enemies. So they accepted the idea of rebel occupation of U.S. properties and taking U.S. hostages long enough for Washington to tell Batista he wasn't going to get any more support in the form of aircraft. Now that threw the whole financial burden for supporting Batista, at least as far as aircraft were concerned, onto the Mafia itself. So now this whole thing is starting to cost Meyer Lansky some money. And that, of course, you know, the Mafia doesn't like money to go any way, any direction except one way, one direction, to it. He doesn't want to have to pay out money to support a two-bit military dictator that can't handle it himself. On July 18th of '58, the Cuban Army, the Batista Army, landed Battalion 18 at the mouth of the La Plata River, and they fought this Battle of La Plata and the Battle of El Higuey. Now, their idea was to try to close in on Turquino Peak, which was, they knew, the rebel headquarters, and that's where all of the radio broadcasting was coming from to the rest of the nation. A second battalion was landed to try and help, but it was also halted at the beach. A third battalion was sent to help, but they ran into another part of Castro's forces, and they could not push through the roadblocks. After more than a week, on July 21st, '58, Battalion 18, the original one that landed in La Plata, surrendered, with 40 dead, 30 wounded, 240 holding up their hands going into POW status. Castro's men lost only 3, which was good, because as small as they are, they can't afford to lose very many. Batistas Cantillo had launched his final offensive against the rebel headquarters at Mount Turquino on the 11th of July, but by July 15th, the stall and retreat operation of Che's defense strategy had suddenly switched to a counterattack. Che was now chief of staff at the Mount Turquino Supreme Headquarters, where Fidel was supreme commander. Specifically, Che was now in charge of the defense of Mount Turquino. Fidel took command of the counterattack on the ground against the advancing Cantillo forces on this immediate front and launched the rebel counteroffensive. The rebels began surrendering an Army battalion to El Higuey despite continuous air attack. When Battalion 18 decided to surrender, an old classmate of Fidel's, named who is now a major, named Jose Quevedo, commanded it, and Fidel sent him a letter saying, you know, we're old friends from the old days. There's no reason for you and your men to die here. You can become prisoners, and we will turn you over to the Red Cross, and you can keep your sidearms. As far as the officers are concerned, we won't humiliate you. So Quevedo had decided to surrender, and he did. Finally, July 29th through August 8th, there's the Battle of Las Mercedes. General Cantillo decided to withdraw Battalion 17, but he planned to make a withdrawal a trap if Castro chose to follow the retreating soldiers. This resulted in the Battle of Las Mercedes. The trap and more than 70 men were killed in the first 2 days of fighting, including a senior rebel leader, René Ramos Latour, who caught Castro's troops for the first time. Castro managed to get his army out of the trap by opening negotiations with General Cantillo and Batista. Cantillo flees. On August 8, 1958, all of Castro's forces had escaped, and the government offensive was over. The army had left 400 men behind in a panic flight from the Sierra, and the rebels turned over these POWs to the Red Cross. Of greater value were all the weapons that Cantillo left behind, including 1 tank, 12 mortars, 12 tripod machine guns, 200 submachine guns, thousands of automatic rifles, and enormous quantities of ammunition, and so much equipment it was difficult to get a handle on the total and cart it away. 1 month later, rebel columns departed from Las Villas and Pinar del Rio. So now, after the defeat of the Batista offensive, Batista withdraws his forces to the Oriente borders altogether and gets ready to try and keep them isolated. Now, if you've seen these movies that I've mentioned to you, you know that the Battle of Santa Clara is going to end this war. Now, this is how this develops. The general staff under Fidel and Che decide that what they're going to do is take this war to the rest of the island. To do that, they're going to have to take their men all the way across and then attack in Las Villas province, the capital city of which is Santa Clara, and another column is going to go all the way to Pinar del Rio and do the same thing there. And the idea being, and then Fidel's main forces will move on Santiago. So they will be attacking the dictatorship in 3 different cities on both ends of the island and in the very middle of the island. And then they'll close on Havana. That's the strategy. What happened in practice is that they got all of their forces ready for this march, and they got attacked by Batista's Air Force on August 31st. And it destroyed all of the vehicles that were going to be carrying Che and Camilo's forces. Camilo Cienfuegos was going to take the column that went all the way to Pinar del Rio. Che was taking the column all the way to Las Villas. Raul was already in charge of the column in the northern Oriente, and Fidel was going to take Santiago with his main force column. Well, now they're going to have to walk there. Now this is a different ballgame. First of all, it's going to take longer. Secondly, it's going to be a lot harder. But they had expected to be in Las Villas by September 3rd. But instead, on horse and by foot, by September 9th, they'd gotten only as far as southern Camagüey province, and the Batistas Army and Air Force had kept up a constant bombardment and counterattack on their movements. So on the 11th of September of 58, Che's forces and Camilo's met up, and they decided that it would be the better part of valor to forget about Pinar del Rio, combine their forces, and take Las Villas province. They radioed for Supreme Headquarters approval, and Fidel radioed his approval of the change in strategic planning. And so Pinar del Rio was out of the picture for the moment. Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos are now going to take the northern part of Las Villas, and beginning in Hagaway and proceeding to Santa Clara. Che would take the southern part of Las Villas and start toward Santa Clara from that direction, and Camilo would take the northern part of Las Villas and start on Santa Clara from that direction, in other words. So the first thing he has to do is assert his authority as Supreme Commander for the Las Villas Civil War for the 26th of July movement over the entire rebel movement in that province. Now, a lot of people have been inspired by what Fidel has done, and they have sent their own armed forces into the mountains of Las Villas province, and they have their own objectives. I won't go through all of those differences, but Che Guevara has got to take control of all of them, and he gives them a choice. You either do what we tell you to do, or we'll make you do what we tell you to do. It's up to you. We don't want to have to fight our brothers in arms, but we are going to attack these columns. You're either going to help us, or you're going to stand aside and get left behind. And suffice that to say, he does get all of that taken. So, on October 10th, the rebel headquarters announces the first law of the revolution, which is going to be for agrarian reform. And it's going to go, all of the land in Cuba is going to go to those people who work on it without any bullshit about conditions. The details of how many acres each would receive will be worked out after victory, but there isn't going to be any concession to the Yankee foreign landholders. In the end, they each get about 66 acres. That's a few days later, on October 16th, the Che Guevara's column has gotten all the way up to the Baragua sugar mill, and they're ready to jump off and start the fight for the city of Santa Clara. They're finally in a position to smash the Batista Army and conquer all of Santa Clara, but they're going to have to do it fast. In other words, they're going to have a deep battle kind of strategy, not give the enemy a chance to regroup. What they've got going for them is that the mass of people in all of these towns of Las Villas that they're going to liberate hate the Batista government, and they hate the local cops. So they are quite willing to support these revolutionary fighters. And of course, they're getting daily propaganda blasts to encourage them to revolt from Radio Rebelde. Suffice it to say that they're all brought under control. Now, the one group that didn't send armed forces into the hills of Las Villas and maintain a separate command, or try to maintain a separate command, was the Communist Party. In May of 1958, Blas Roca, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, announced that the PSP was giving Fidel its unqualified support. I read about this in Political Affairs magazine, which was the monthly journal in the United States of the Communist Party. It's a monthly theoretical journal. Obviously, this was a long time before the CPUSA became nothing more than an FBI instrument as it is today, but in those days it was still a good organization. Che's Lightning campaign now had loyal Communist Party troops under its campaign. They had under its command. They had voluntarily come over, and so he had his 26th of July Corps plus the Communist Party troops, and they didn't have too much trouble forcing the others. The way they forced the others, though, was interesting. They would tell them, look, we're going to take this De Miranda mountain garrison site, and then we're going to take Banao, this next site after that, and we want you to participate with us. But if you don't, we're just going to leave you behind. So they eventually began to bring all of these other guys in under the discipline of the 26th of July Command. And Fidel had told Che before he left that this wasn't going to be an easy task, that you've got at least 6 major contending forces out there, and they all have their own objectives. They all want a piece of the action. They're all run, except for the communists, by one warlord or another who has his own specific objectives that he wants to set up in the post-Batista period. So Che had done an extremely good job of doing exactly what Fidel told him to do. Now, one of the things they wanted to prevent at all cost is a new phony election that Batista has set up for November 3rd. Well, they do prevent it. This election is a complete failure, so it doesn't fool anybody. Hardly anybody participates in it. Certainly nobody in the war zone. So that option is over. Now finally, they get into position by December 16th, where Che's forces have cut all the roads and bridges leading to and from the capital of Las Villas, which is Santa Clara. Camilo Cienfuegos has likewise taken all the towns and army outposts in the north of Las Villas province and cut all the bridges and roads leading to the capital from that direction. So the capital is now surrounded. It has only one link to the outside world, and that's a railroad link that goes to Havana. Batista knows he has to reinforce his last major garrison in Santa Clara and win there, or face the defeat of his entire war effort. Che's forces entered the outskirts of Santa Clara on December 29, 1958, after taking the last remaining towns to be liberated before Santa Clara, which were Placetos, Remedios, Carabarien, and Camawani. Santa Clara was a large city at that time of about 160,000 people, and the center of a railroad connection from Havana to the rest of the Republic. Batista sent an armored train full of troops, and most importantly weapons, to relieve the Santa Clara garrison. But the rebels knew it was coming, and they intercepted the armored train before it could enter the city, and they destroyed it, along with its troops, who surrendered, and they took all of those armaments that Batista had been sending to his garrison for their own. So now they had everything they needed to defeat Batista's 10 tanks and anti-aircraft guns to drive off the last of his remaining warplanes, and when they fired over open sights, they were also used as artillery. Thousands of garrison troops began surrendering in Santa Clara. Even the secret police, who occupied the highest building in the town, the highest rooftop was on the Grand Hotel in the capital city, were eventually forced to surrender when rebels accessed the rooftop. Again, those two movies that I have cited to you before, Fidel and Che Part 1, show you those have a reenactment, which is extremely good. This is also the time that Che meets his second wife-to-be, Aleda March. Aleda is a young woman who had fled her hometown because her work for the 26th of July Underground had been discovered, so she was fleeing for her life. She had come to their headquarters and volunteered to assist Che Guevara. He had given her an initial job of collecting taxes from landowners, and she had wanted to get in on this seizure, but he had told her no. He wanted her to stay behind, but eventually he realizes that he needs her because she really does know Santa Clara, and so she gets in the Jeep and she's with him. And this is in 2 days they've got to take all of Santa Clara, and this is a big city, as I say, 160,000 men. It's new to them. They've never been there before, so they need the girl, and she is a pretty big help to them. Well, on the final night, that is December 31st, 1958, Batista's having a huge party at his palace in Havana, where all of his sycophants and foreign dignitaries, mafiosos and gringo officials from the embassy and so on are assembled. And what they don't know is that Batista's already cashed in everything he can. He's got about $300 million in cash, which is a lot more in 1958 than it is now. Remember, Nixon devalued the dollar by 500%. So if you just want to multiply by 300 million by 5, you've got $1.5 billion in 1971 dollars. At any rate, he takes his cash and he's taken off. That night he gives his last speech to his friends and sycophants and all of these mafia and embassy guests that are there, and tells them, well, I'm leaving, the war is over, good luck to all of you, and takes off. Takes his $300 million, goes to Miami. The rest of them realize, well, it's all over, we got to get the hell out of here because these rebels may not look kindly upon us when they get here. Well, that one of the first things I heard about this period of time when I went to Mexico in '62 from Carlos Prieto was, he said, you know, there were a lot of people in the States at that time that thought of George Raft as an actor who played gangster parts. But he was really a gangster who was part-time actor. And most of you young people won't remember George Raft, but those of you who are my age certainly will. At any rate, he was exactly that, a guy who played gangsters in movies at the time, but he was also a real gangster. So he was in Havana that night, and he had to get out of town. So when Mario Puzo wrote the book The Godfather, and he shows all of these mafiosos running for it, you know, this is a very historical setting. The guys like George Raft did run for it. Well, they all had private planes, and it was no big deal for them to jump 90 miles across the water to Key West or someplace in Florida, and so they did. That is the end. What happens then is that they do take all of Santa Clara. Batista sees that it's all over for him. He's got his money ready on his plane. He takes off, goes to Miami. Fidel takes Santiago. Then he goes on a long march, long in the sense that it takes him 5 days to go from Santiago to Havana. They're driving slowly as he's standing in this Jeep, and he's giving a speech to everybody that will listen along the way. And of course, there's tens of thousands of people that are lining these highways to see these rebels for the first time and listen to what Fidel Castro has to say. And he has a lot to say. So it takes him 5 days talking to the entire nation, and this entire thing is videotaped. It's broadcast, I should say, to the entire nation live on all of Cuba's television stations. There's nobody who wants to watch anything except this once-in-a-lifetime historical march of a liberator of Cuba from Santiago to Havana. So by the time he gets there, there's 1 million Cubans waiting in the square to greet him. Nothing like this has ever happened in Cuba before. And, well, this is the end of the first phase of the Cuban Revolution, and so it's also the end of chapter 31, The Fight for Communism in Cuba, which in each of these chapters I try to take things up to the point at which the communists won state power, or, as in the case of Mexico, where they got up to some equivalent point where we can cut off the story. Now, in Cuba, of course, we got another 50-odd years of history of fighting U.S. imperialism by a communist government in power. And in the 2016 edition, it's my intention, if I'm still around by then, to finish up the story on Cuba and to finish up the story of bringing it up to speed anyway on Mexico. In the next lecture, we're going to move on to Nicaragua, and we'll again follow the same pattern of following the revolution up until the time the communists seized power in Nicaragua. And at that point, I'm going to stop for now and just say a couple more things in summary sidelines here. So at the time that I was learning about the Cuban Revolution at the foot of Carlos Prieto, I was also learning a little bit about Mexico at that time, because Carlos had not been working just in Cuba on these Cuban films. He had also been doing work for Mexican film production companies, one of which had been a film that he did that I remembered him telling me about in detail, because 20 years later I would be confronting these same people. Now, he was telling me about a trip that he had made to a Pemex refinery in Tampico, and the job was to do a documentary for Pemex about how a refinery works. And as they had approached the plant, some gunmen had stopped them at the road and gotten in the cab, and they told Carlos that he had to pay him X amount of money. Carlos is not yet used to the labor gangsters, even though he probably should have been, because he'd been a Communist Party leader. He probably should have been at least aware of what these guys were like, but he doesn't seem to have been, because he told him, "I'm not going to give you a goddamn penny. Get the hell out of my truck," so on and so forth. Then he went into the Pemex refinery and he spouted off to the manager there about how these guys had tried to shake him down. And the manager said, "You wait here, I'm going to go take care of that." So he did. What he'd done is gone out there and paid these guys. He came back and he said, "You can't talk to a man like Lakina like that." He said, "You're lucky he didn't kill you. The only reason he didn't kill you is because nobody's ever talked to him like that before. He didn't know how to respond." So I remembered this story. I think there was more detail to it, but I remembered the essence of this story. 20 years later, I would be in Mexico again, this time for NL Industries, which at that time was one of the three major oil field service conglomerates in the world, the other two being Schlumberger and Halliburton. And I was their assistant manager for Mexico. And of course, I'd heard all about the union from Carlos 20 years earlier. Lakina was the head of the Oilfield Workers Union of the Republic of Mexico. The union the communists had originally started, the labor gangsters had taken over. I suspect that one of the reasons they were able to take over is that you will recall that the Comintern ordered all of the communist parties around the world to stop strikes and to support the war effort in the English-speaking countries. And in essence, because of the role of the Soviet Union, the Rapallo Pact had turned into an alliance between the Soviet government and Germany against the rest of the capitalist world, into an alliance between the Soviet Union and the English-speaking countries of the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, against the rest of the capitalist world, which was Germany, Italy, Japan, Spain, and so on. So the Latin American communists had a role to play, because in all of those countries that were industrial, like Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, they could, where war production was going to be important for the English-speaking part of the alliance, the communists could play a critical role by being sure there were no strikes. And they took the position that the capitalists should be making sacrifices too. But whether they do or not, the nature of this war is such, we will make the sacrifice. You won't have to worry about labor strikes in Latin America. So that had happened, and now I'm back in Mexico 20 years later, and of course everything has changed dramatically in some ways, and in other ways it hadn't changed at all. It hadn't changed at all with regard to labor. And one of the reasons that I had been sent down there was because our bosses in Houston thought that I had the kind of background that might make it possible for me to deal with the local union boss. And the local union boss for Lakina was waiting for me in the office the day that I got there to my... Nobody else was even in the office yet. I lived in what was called the penthouse, which was on the top floor of this building that was on the Grijalva River. And it was an office building. And I don't even know how he got in there, come to think of it. But at any rate, he was in my office waiting for me when I got in there. And he had a copy of my textbook in archaeology, Foundations of Archaeology, and which is a hardcover book that I had published a few years earlier by a Macmillan subsidiary called Glencoe Press, 576 pages, hardcover. And, oh, there's a squirrel out there. At any rate, he'd been there waiting for me. Well, fortunately, I knew exactly what kind of a union this was. I remembered the stories about Lakina, and I gave this guy the credit of assuming that he's going to be the same thing, and he was exactly the same thing. The two of us became partners in a variety of things, and he saved me later on from a ignominious defeat down there in one way. But at any rate, it was this earlier knowledge that I'd acquired about the Union that I don't think anybody in Houston would have had any reason to know about, but they had the general idea that from whatever they had heard that I could handle myself in a Latin American gangster-like situation. So they had sent me down there to be assistant manager for an excellent oil field manager named E. King Freeland Jr. But King was, like most North Americans, as wise as he was, having been raised in Honduras and speaking Spanish like a native. He still hadn't really internalized what the Mexican gangster class, which is concentrated in the oil field service, well, in the entire Mexican oil industry, but especially in oil field service, what he was up against there. So it turned out I was able to help him, and it turned out that he was able to help me. Well, the reason he was there to see me to begin with is that he had this Montezumas Treasure legend that he was pushing, that I mentioned to you when we were talking about Mexico. As I said before, I don't think there's ever any such thing as Montezuma's Treasure, but it's a legend that had been carried on ever since the day. And Montezuma's Treasure was to have taken on into the lowland with this treasure at very place of New West. The leader, the boss down there that is waiting for me in the office, his name is Luis Contreras. And Contreras shows me some photographs, and he says, I know where this is. This is Montezuma's Treasure, and I need you to authenticate it and help me excavate it and so on. Well, since I didn't even believe the story to begin with, and as a professional archaeologist, I didn't want to get into the artifact selling business. Even if I wasn't practicing archaeology, that was out of the picture, but I couldn't say these things to him. So what I said was, I'll tell you what we better do here. My specialty's in the far north, and what I think about these things doesn't really matter. What we need to do is we need to get somebody that's an expert on Mexican archaeology to take a look at these things and see what he says. And Luis agreed with that, and I said, I'm going to send him to this fellow Michael Coe at Yale, and I did. Now, a little bit of time went by, and I got a letter back from Michael Coe at Yale, and he said, this stuff is obviously fake. You can even see the saw marks on it. Well, I haven't seen that, but he could see it. And, you know, so that's what I needed to know. I told my manager what he said, and he said, well, whatever you do, don't tell Luis about this. So I said, yeah, I understand what you're saying, because right now we've got a tight relationship with Luis Contreras, but if I tell him his stuff is all shit, that's going to go straight down the tube. So right now I know what he's got is a scam that he's trying to drag me into, and King doesn't know enough to realize that it is an outright scam, but he does know that we can't afford to lose the loyalty of Luis Contreras. Now, about this time, we used to pay our workers, field workers, every Friday, and they would come in from the field we'd truck them in there, and they'd come in and they'd come up to the desk and they'd sign a little chip and they'd get their cash for their labor. Well, when I walked into the door on the side of that office one afternoon, the line was lined up there, I saw this Mexican worker I knew from the office reach over and slap my secretary in the face pretty hard. that pissed me off. So I was a young man. In those days I was frequently aggressive and looking for trouble. Some people might say that was a consequence of a unresolved childhood trauma that led to that pattern of behavior, but whatever it was, I walked over to this guy and I cold cocked him in the side of the head as hard as I could, knocked his head through a plate glass window. But the damn thing was, he was twice my size, and even though I'd hit him that hard and put him down on his knees, he was back up on his feet in no time. So I knew I had to finish this guy off, and I reached over and I found a heavy glass ashtray and I slammed him in the head as he took me down, and slammed him again and again. It didn't seem to have any effect at all. This is the most hard-headed guy I'd ever seen. So, well, what it did do was give time for other people to jump in there and pull us apart, including the assistant manager for all of Mexico had come down from Mexico City, and he came running out of my office to see what was going on, and the girls, the secretaries, told him what had happened, and he said, Jason, you better pack your bags. He said, you can't hit a Mexican worker. The union's going to demand that you be kicked out of the country right away. And about this time, a fellow named Jose Medrano, an engineer who I'd befriended in Homa when I was up in Louisiana, and he'd come up for training, he stepped in there and he said, actually, I think that if you go see your friend Luis Contreras, he might be able to fix this up for you. And Wally Reed, the American who was so scared that something bad was going to happen because of this fight, who told me to pack my bags and get out of there, he said, yeah, you better go see Contreras because he's the only chance you got. So Medrano and I got in the truck, and I'm still thinking about the fight, you know, how that thing went down. Wish that I had done this instead of that. Kicked him in here instead of there. Whatever it was. Medrano's saying, look, there's something I've got to tell Luis Contreras that will change the perspective on this, but I only want to tell this story once. So I will wait till we get out there. And he said, the only reason I'm helping you like this is because even though you're a foreigner and these are Mexicans that are involved, the way you helped me when I was up there in Louisiana, I haven't forgotten it. So I was thinking about that too. As we pulled up to this Pemex compound and we went in there and drove over to the office building where Luis Contreras had his office. We went upstairs there. We sat in front of his desk, and Medrano started speaking to him in Spanish, telling him what had happened, and I was listening. I'll tell you what he was saying in English was, he said, now this guy that Jason hit is part of a gang that's planning on assassinating the governor of Tabasco. Well, now I'm glad he didn't tell me this on the way over. So anyway, I'm looking at him like, what? And so, but Luis Contreras, he's taking this like, okay, all right. Now Contreras, Medrano tells him, he drives around in this car with dark windows, which was not normal at the time, and no license plates, which is typical for somebody that's working for the secret police. He, you know, I know about this because he's put together a little group of people out there, and they have stolen explosives out of our explosive locker, and they're putting them underneath this stadium or the stand where the governor of Tabasco's going to be talking. They're going to blow him up. Well, the governor of Tabasco is also a pre-party member and a governor. So Contreras reaches in his hip pocket, he pulls out his wallet, shows us a badge and a plastic card, which says that he's in the secret police too. So all these secrets are coming out. He reaches in his other pocket, he comes out with some money, he hands to Medrano, and he said, this is for now, and he said, you're going to be getting a check from the Federal Judicial Police pretty soon for your assistance in this matter. And he says, you, meaning me, you go back home and forget about this. Nothing's going to happen. You're going to everything's going to be just fine, and I'm going to go find this son of a bitch that, and take care of that matter. Well, by the time I left that building, that fist fight had turned into a matter of national security. I didn't know what to think anymore, and I wasn't saying very much at all, but what happened was that we never heard from that worker again. I'm assuming that Contreras found him and something happened. You either sent him away into a permanent exile or you put him 6 feet under. I don't know. I never asked. I didn't want to know. But I do know one thing. He never came back to work for us. Now, the point to all of this is that these are some of the things that connect me in Mexico from the first time that I heard about the Union when I was learning about it from Carlos Prieto in my 1962 trip, and now my 1982 trip where I'm working for NL Industries and have already gone through my experiences in Peru. So I've learned how to handle gangsters in the police, out of the police, and in the government, out of the government, and everywhere else. So a lot of this experience of mine is paying off. In this next lecture, we're going to move on to Nicaragua. But I wanted to conclude this part of the Cuban Revolution right here by saying the war is over. But phase 2 is about to begin because the revolution has just begun. This is exactly the phrase that Fidel, Raúl, Camilo, and Che Guevara were using to everybody that they talked to. Yes, the Civil War is over, but the revolution has just begun. So at that point, I'm going to stop this tape for today, and we'll go on next time with the fight for communism in Nicaragua.